We're going to talk about Snuffleupagus and PHP stuff. You might have seen some part of this talk before because we gave it like a couple of times in France, Luxembourg, Germany as well, Switzerland also. And but we added a lot more content in it, so fear not. Obviously, we're French. That's why we have such a funny accent.
So we're happy to be here. We are working in a French company called NBS System. So we are doing mostly web hosting and trying to prevent our customers from getting owned on a daily basis. So it's e-commerce hosting, institutional hosting, and that's the reason why we're presenting Snuffleupagus today, because most of our customers are dealing with PHP. Amongst you are some people having to defend PHP on a daily basis.
But we went a bit deeper and we audited PHP internal code, and it's a really interesting piece of software. We would recommend if you like to audit some C code. But on a more serious basis, we're hosting like really a lot of websites, like several thousand of them. And PHP is a really nice language if you like to do unauthorized remote administration, I guess. That's what we would say it. And the question that we're trying to solve, because we're working in the defensive side, is how to prevent people from administrating the website on a benevolent basis.
So we already worked quite hard to try to harden this, because one of the changes that we are not allowed to replace the developers, threaten them, or fix the code in any way. So we try to harden the stack itself. We are going from the lower levels, like the system with, thanks to GR security. We already published an open source web application firewall for Nginx. And we have some kind of homegrown IDS software. However, as we are not allowed to touch the code, sometimes we are lacking a bit of context when we are trying to virtual patches vulnerabilities at the web application firewall level. Hence, the idea of going at the engine level, as once again, we are not allowed to touch the code itself.
That's why we should harden PHP itself. There was the Voisin patch, maybe some of you know about it. It's a great PHP module written by the fancy people of Germany, from Section 1, especially Stefan Esser. I really like his work. And this talk is a complete ripoff of a Voisin feature, actually. It's super nice, but it doesn't scale very well, and it doesn't fly on PHP7. So what could we do? And we thought about it, and we had the great idea of writing our own PHP module because we had way too much free time. So we wrote it in C, because why not? And we called it the Snuffleupagus.
So the name might sound not very friendly for people or for people at all. However, as you will see, Snuffleupagus has been chosen because, as you can see, it's quite a magnificent creature. And actually, it comes from Sesame Street. And it's a very fluffy elephant, as is the elephant of PHP itself. Admires the magnificence of the animal itself.
Like PHP.
So it does live as a PHP module. So the good point is that we wanted something that is not too disruptive to embed into hosting platforms. So as it lives as a PHP module, we can simply add it. It doesn't imply too much changes to the platform. It's easily packaged and added to existing PHP stacks. Virtual patching. So as we were saying, we are greatly inspired by Voisin, however, and the engine of PHP itself. However, like for example, the vanilla hardening of PHP allows you to enable or disable some dangerous function, but it completely lacks of granularity. So either you will disallow system, for example, which allows you to execute system command on the whole PHP stack, or you allow it completely. However, even legitimate software, they might require it, for example, for upgrades. Thus, either you have software that can't upgrade itself, or you have a system that is quite easily backdoored.
And that's how Snuffleupagus might help you, actually. We provide granular virtual patching directly inside of PHP. So for example, you can see on the first line that you are able to drop the system function completely. However, on the second line, the second part actually of the slide, you can drop the system function, but only, you can allow it, sorry, actually only on the up file, but drop it everywhere else. And the last part is you can match on a file name and also this checksum. So it makes the attacker job a lot more harder, actually. And we provide a simple PHP script so you can freeze the usage and the call site of the dangerous function inside of your application.
And even, like, for example, this feature alone, as we have seen countless and countless WordPress websites getting owned and backdoored, will raise the bar a lot for the attacker, because the usual scheme is that they are going somehow to get access to the back office, either through a bug or weak password, and then they are going to backdoor existing PHP files to add a backdoor in it. However, while using like a hashing mechanism, it will make the backdoor non-functional at all, and he will simply move away and find another target.
Can do a lot of stuff with PHP level virtual patching, surprisingly. One of the main advantages compared to WAF and all the fancy boxes is that we are operating directly at the PHP level, so there is no disparity between two parsers, because most of the time the WAF tries to be clever and to interpret the data in a way that he will disagree, for example, with PHP, leading to all kinds of bypasses. But since we are at the same level, there are much more overlap. About the syntax, we've got a lot of filters. You can filter on the IP. So for example, you can restrict the usage of the system function to your local administrator. You can filter on functions, call trace. You can dereference methods. You can filter on a lot of stuff. And we spent really much time documenting it and testing it on various exploits and vulnerability, like every single WordPress vulnerability. The RIPS people also did an advent calendar with exotic vulns that we managed to patch almost all of them, high-profile exploit, and also around vulnerability that we will talk about on Friday with the workshop. For example,
so this one, the first line, for example, it's a perfect example of something that is usually very hard to patch at a web application for a level, where we're going to deny internal func to be called from method 1 of a specific class. So it allows you as well to virtual patch some more logical kind of bugs, which are usually not the kind of stuff that is easy to deal with a web application file. As well, we can restrict call to some specific functions from a known IP, or we can simply drop any request where a known parameter contains bad pattern or things like this. And there's quite a lot of filters, so the idea is that you are able to literally virtual patch almost anything, or at least that's the goal we are trying to achieve.
And now we're going to list every single class of vulnerability that we're killing with Snuffleupagus. For example, system injection. The documentation is saying that you're not supposed to pass arbitrary inputs to the system commands, or at least that you should filter it. But fortunately, or unfortunately, depending on which side of the barrier you're standing, people are doing silly stuff and popping shells. That's why you get several remote code execution on Squirrel Mail, DocuWiki, MediaWiki also, I think, at some point. And the way we're killing it is actually pretty simple. We say that in the function system, the parameter command is not allowed to match the following regex, like $, pipe, semicolon, ampersand, and backticks, and new line. So it's much harder to actually do a shell injection. It's still possible, of course, but it still raises the bar a bit.
Another example, which is maybe less known but still quite devastating, is extra parameter of the mail command, where when an attacker is able to to specify the extra parameter, he will be able to provide an argument that will lead to remote code execution. It was prepared by the handful RIPS people, and so the documentation says that the additional flag needs to be controlled. However, people usually don't really know what it stands for, so they just let user control it. So what we are getting is various remote code execution, some of which affect like a PHP mailer, which is basically used by any PHP software that is used to send mail, including RunCube and so on, and so actually most of the webmails. So what we are doing is that simply we are dropping the dash in the extra parameter so that the user cannot specify an extra parameter leading to remote code execution. Because in most of the use case, actually it's never used except for malevolent usage. So with this temporary, we can more or less kill the vulnerability itself.
But those are a rule that you're supposed to write, and writing rule is boring, because you may want to patch the latest Joomla remote code execution or the WordPress one, and you have to wake up at like 6 a.m. because your time zone is screwed compared to the one the Joomla is, and this kind of stuff. So maybe we can kill vulnerability in a generic manner, for example. One of my favorites one is actually cookie stealing via XSS. When you've got an XSS, the stupid basic payload is to actually steal the cookie from the user so you can impersonate him. But we stole this ID from Thibault. The ID is to encode the cookie with a secret key tied to the user agent and the IP or something else, but client-specific material, cryptographic material. So even if an attacker managed to steal your cookie, he cannot use it because it's not able to provide this user-tied material. Thibault used to use the IP address, but in 2018, people are doing roaming a lot. Like, for example, you're using your mobile phone to go on Facebook, and then you connect to the Wi-Fi, and then you go outside, there is no more Wi-Fi, so you change your network, your IP address change, your cookie is invalidated, and you need to relog in. That's why someone from actually it's a sponsor from the conference, the safepace.me people, had the bright idea of using the TLS extended master key. So when you connect to Facebook, you negotiate with a TLS session to get an extended master key. And even if you change NP, you do not renegotiate the TLS connection. So even with roaming, you don't need to relog in. That's nice because an attacker is not able to steal it. So it's a pretty nice idea, I think. And still about cookie, if you're coming via HTTPS, the cookie is marked secure. So you're not authorized to send it through HTTP. Also, if the cookie are encrypted via our encryption mechanism, it comes with HTTP only, so you're not allowed to access them via JavaScript because they are unusable anyway. And also, I really like this, the same side thing to kill a CSRF. So you can say on every single cookie, put the same side flag, or on two cookie matching this rejects, put the same side stuff. And I think that by default, it's activated on session cookies. So it really raised the bar for cross-site request forgery.
So then file uploads, I think it's one of the vulnerabilities that is most commonly found. So the documentation is actually warning you. Okay, if you don't validate the files, they can access sensitive information, can lead to code execution, etc., etc. However, people are not reading the documentation, and they are letting user upload vulnerabilities. So I think at least for PHP software, it's one of the most common vulnerabilities. So it started quite early, and there are way too much vulnerability of this kind that even when you're looking for CVs, they just tell you, okay, there's a lot of those. So what we are doing to kill it is that once again, it's ideas that we borrowed from Thibault, that you can provide a validation script that will be used to validate the file before it's made accessible to the PHP engine. And what we're using is that we're using something called VLD, so Vulkan Logic Disassembler. And it will allow you to precompile the opcode of the PHP file, and you will be able to know if the file is a valid PHP that can be executed at all. You don't have to attempt to do some nasty and inefficient tricks such as relying on the MIME type, etc. And you will really let the PHP engine decide by itself whether it will execute it by generating the opcode. And if it contains PHP code, you are going to simply drop it.
I really like this one, unserialize. I think there is going to be a workshop about unserialization, but in Java at some point. This one is obviously about PHP. The document is saying that you're not supposed to pass untrusted input to a serialized and unserialized routine, but people think that serializing is so handy to pass data around that they are doing it anyway. And I'm going to rant about PHP, really hard, because I was browsing the bug tracker of PHP and I stumbled upon this gem. It's a PHP developer saying, yeah, you found a memory corruption in an unserialization routine, but since the documentation say that you're not supposed to do that, it's not a security issue. And we really disagree about that. That's not how you're supposed to deal with security vulnerability. You're not supposed to fix it by documenting that it's vulnerable, that you're not supposed to do it. You're supposed to fix your memory corruption, for fuck's sake. So we're getting a lot of remote code execution in basically every single big software, I guess, like forums or CMS. We even found a remote route in Observium via unserialized because of the reasons. And the way to kill it is actually hinted in the documentation of PHP itself, but it's not done in PHP, in the PHP core. That's really upsetting me. We simply put a hashMAC. We got a secret key on the server, and when we generate the serialized payload, we guarantee its integrity via hashMAC. It's that easy, and it works, and it doesn't allow an attacker to actually forge an unserialized payload to get a shell.
So Rand, so again, the documentation is a pretty straightforward thing that you should not use it for generating strong cryptographic materials, but people are not really reading the documentation and they're using Ren, which is an unsafe version, for doing things that are quite sensitive. So I think it's maybe one of the very common kind of familiar vulnerabilities that is leading to very funny vulnerabilities from CAPTCHA bypass, authentication bypass, session issues, etc. And what we are doing is that simply we are helping the developer read the documentation by replacing the call to rand to empty rand, so that by default they are going to use a secure random function.
There is also the XXE. Basically, you're able to read file if you forge some really fancy XML documents. And the PHP documentation doesn't mention this at all. I don't know why. And funny anecdote, PHP comes with a 3 or 4 XML parser, I think, because reasons also. And people are passing untrusted XML documents to the parsers, and that's how you get XXE. And it led, of course, to a lot of CVE. And the trick to call it is pretty simple. There is a single call to disable XXE support for every single XML parser in PHP. So we're calling it at the beginning of the request, and then we are just noping the call to the function itself. So the developer cannot actually re-enable this function. That's simple.
Stream wrappers. So PHP support values can actually quite a lot of streams, including OG, for example, because it might be useful. But there's a lot of wrappers, and it can be used in exploitation when there's like file manipulation operations, because it will either allow you to get code execution or simply get easier access to bypass any kind of validation or verification. So, for example, with a file, you can easily get file access, you get zip bombs, you can whitelist bypass with a zip. There's a lot of possible usage. And once again, it's a typical example of one of the features that exists in PHP and that is mostly used by malevolent people and rarely for legitimate usage. So what we are simply providing is features that will allow you to whitelist or blacklist specific stream wrappers in order to only allow the ones that are useful in your application and avoiding stupid bypass.
We borrowed this feature from, actually someone on the bug tracker asked us, what about whitelisting the stream wrappers? And I browsed to a PHP source code and its documentation, and I stumbled upon an issue in the PHP bug tracker with someone asking for this feature like years ago, and no one cared. Maybe we should read a more PHP bug tracker to find some good ideas.
Thanks, features.
This one is also great. It smells a bit like JavaScript. PHP has a lot of ways to do comparison. This is an excerpt of the documentation. And this is another one. It's an entirely different table. And I really like, for example, when you're comparing true and -1, it's actually true, because why not? Or when you compare 0, the number, to 0, the string, it's also true. And I would bet that if we made a quiz with this array, a lot of PHP developers would get it wrong, because it doesn't make any sense. Also, the comparison operator in PHP are not in a total order. So you can get A is greater than B, greater than C, greater than A, B, C, and so on. Because PHP madness. And people are trying to use PHP like it's a normal and decent language, and they get bitten. For example, if you compare the password comparison with 2 equals, or the function array search that you can use to search for a value in an array, but there is a third optional parameter that is strict, and if you not enable it, there is smart comparison happening in the array search function. There is also the infamous SHA-1 collision. Obviously, two strings do not have the same SHA-1, but in the PHP world, yes, they do. And the latest one is because the second value is starting with 1e, meaning that it's 1 and like a scientific notation, and the same for the value on the left. So just normal PHP stuff. And if you grep for the double equal sign, a lot of PHP code base, you will stumble upon a lot of vulnerability, and it leads to, I don't know, password comparison being skewed, or CSRF token being brute forceable, even the e-commerce website using it to compare currencies. So that's not a great idea. And we are killing it by using I really like it, the strict mode of PHP. In the newer version of PHP, PHP7 and 7.1 maybe, they introduced the strict mode, and all the core functions are annotated via types. Like, for example, if you've got the array search, the second parameter must be an array. And it's optional, but if you enable this mode, PHP might throw an error saying, hey, you're not giving me the right type, something is wrong. But there is no way to activate globally in PHP, so we hacked it, so you can just set please Snuffleupagus enable the strict mode globally, and you don't have type confusion in core functions anymore. And also, we are replacing the opcode, the equal opcode, for the identical one. So if you type double in PHP, you'll get a triple one. So no more fancy smart comparisons.
So this one is a series of example of virtual patches. One of the very common annoying behavior we get from an unnamed e-commerce framework is a tendency to require the developer or suggest the developer to shmod 777 everything, because your life is a lot easier like this. So you can simply drop the call in order to stop this from happening. So either with a number of when it's specifying with others. As well, we can detect, make a backdoor detection easier by detecting when they are making call to init or is callable for dangerous functions such as a system, etc. The one with a read-only exec-enable is very useful and interesting, because we can simply tell PHP to only allow execution of code that is read-only. So when you have a backdoor that can be uploaded or a file that can be modified by the PHP engine, we are going to simply deny it from being executed. We can as well detect, make some detection. So we have a directive that is dump that will simply instruct Snuffleupagus to dump the content of the whole request on the file system. And we can then get all the requests that are going to trigger errors in MySQL call, so which will make easier detection to harvest ODE, which we are going to speak a bit later. Or as well, like to ensure or force the certificate verification at the PHP engine. For example, for curl, in order to force the certificate verification and block some unverified certificate call.
Because surprisingly, the certificate validation is on by default in PHP. That's one of the few good value by default that you might find. Speaking of free stuff, we're using it internally to find some new vulnerabilities. Because if you have a system like this, system grep a variable and then a file, instead of auditing the code, you can just throw some rules that are pretty lax, like you say there is an allow at the end, so the request will not be dropped. But there is also a dump keyword, meaning that if the execution flow of PHP matches this rule, the whole request will be dumped on the file system and you'll get a notification. So that's pretty handy. Also, as mentioned on this slide, there is the MySQL query, and even if it happens to return false, we're going to dump the request. So we have a lot of passive rules that are silently getting a vulnerability for us. It's pretty nice.
So in terms of performance, because it's quite a recurrent question, the performance impact actually is quite lightweight because we are kind of only hooking the function on which we are applying virtual patches. And we have it running on some rather big website, at least one Alexa top 1K website, and various e-commerce websites, which are some heavy PHP machinery. And the thing that it's a good point of having it developed in C with performance in mind is that we are trying as much as possible to lower the impact. And in terms of actual production, I mean an actual website with database, etc., and not simply running PHP code, the impact is not noticeable.
But even if we are running, we had our intern, we make him benchmark Snuffleupagus on Joomla test suite, and the results were pretty much the same. So we don't have any measurable impact on Joomla's test suite. I don't know if it's significant or not. I think it's still a great number, actually. So it's running at full speed, and this is so I imagine PHP running actually like screaming and just going forward. Obviously, it's not complete. We've got a lot of stuff to do because there are still vulnerabilities that we didn't kill yet, like SQL injection, for example. And we would like to implement more and more handy hardening feature. And actually, I think the last 3 or 4 features that we implemented in Snuffleupagus were asked or suggested by users at a conference or in the bug tracker, or from people coming to us and saying, my developer is doing this kind of shit, how could you mitigate it or patch it or improve the security of my website? Also, we have like 24 filters, I think, but there are still some vulnerability that we struggle to patch. So we might need to provide even more coverage or even more flexibility to the virtual patching process. And also a party time for the version 1.0 that we might release at some point, maybe next year, I don't know. And Friday morning, we are going to give a 2-hour workshop about Snuffleupagus.
So the idea of the workshop is that we had an intern with a bit too much spare time, so we make him audit various CMS, less famous CMS solutions. So don't expect WordPress all day, but various CMS solutions in order just to find bugs in real life that are undiscovered so far, and to see how easily we can patch them with Snuffleupagus. So the idea is that we are going to put out some vulnerabilities that were found. How can we virtual patch them? And as well, we are going to use some more classical things such as a vulnerable web application and see how we can address each of the vulnerabilities. So at the end, Snuffleupagus is really something that we built with ops in mind. So we are the security team and we are working with ops, and we are trying to build something that is easily configurable. So we are trying to avoid some mistakes that might have existed in a SEO where it's like all black or white, to have something with more granularity, where you can use one feature, not the other. You have a learning mode that is present so that you can run it in a production website without breaking everything. You can simply harvest data. You have some tools to generate a whitelist, as we were explaining earlier. So it's something that is really intended with a production-ready mindset in order not to break the production and help the developers fixing them bug without even noticing it.
Of course, it's open source, so you can get it on GitHub. And I spent countless hours writing kind of decent documentation. And I throw some admin Cs on the documentation, telling them, please patch this vulnerability, and they managed to do it. So apparently, it's kind of usable. And also, you can come talk to us. We are the guy with the French accent. And of course, Friday during the workshop. Speaking of open source, a lot of projects that are presented at conferences are dying like 2 weeks after being presented because no one cares about them. The difference with Snuffleupagus is that we're using it internally because we are web hosters, so it's not going to die. I hope.
Hope so.
Hope so. Yeah, maybe if the company is dying, the Snuffleupagus might die at some point, but it's not planned. So yeah, it has been in development since 1 year, and it's attracting contributors and IDs, and people are using it. We have someone that came on the bug tracker. It was reporting a bug, and we fixed it. And the guy was super happy, and he said, "Oh, I'm going to test it on a pool of tests of I don't know, a small number, 200 customers maybe." And we were like, "Wow, that's a big number." So apparently, there are people that are slowly trying to use it in production, and even big players. We bitch a lot on PHP during this talk. I spent 1 year digging into PHP source code. It wasn't fun, trust me. I have a lot of story that I can tell you around the beer maybe later about PHP. For example, PHP supports emoji, but it's not. It wasn't the main goal. It's actually a side effect of PHP. It doesn't support emoji natively. Kinda, it's complicated. Anyway, Björn Strömsmut, the guy that invented C++. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's he said that. So everybody is complaining about PHP, but PHP is running a lot of websites, and I think it's actually great to empower people to be able to write websites, Magento and WordPress and things like that. Thanks to PHP, we have the World Wide Web as we know it currently, because I think that the OpenBSD people are writing websites in C, but I wouldn't recommend anyone to do it. Yes, they do. So yeah, we're bitching about PHP, but we still like it in some ways. Also, we want to thank a lot of people.
So the RIPS people for a great scanner in their calendar as well. And of course, Xiaoxin for the inspiration, because one of the main reasons we actually started to write Snuffleupagus is that we spent so much time using Xiaoxin that we started to identify its limit, and we noticed that they were not really willing to port it to PHP7. And people, or greener pigs, to alpha test everything in production, even when it was giving some crashes. Yeah, there were some crazy people. We just announced Snuffleupagus and say, yeah, it's completely alpha, it might crash. And some guy tested it in production, was like, yeah, my website is working, hooray, you didn't crash it. So yeah, friends and guinea pigs. And finally, as it's a defensive open source project, we are welcoming everybody to give us constructive feedback, either like this feature doesn't work, or this is a bad idea, or having a more critical look at the code and the features and how to make it more usable for everybody. And of course, 44con for accepting the talk, even we wish there will be more people in the assembly tonight. Yeah, apparently nobody cares about PHP, and we've got a lot of time. So speaking about calling us names, when we released the project, we wrote some article, and we published it on Reddit. And there is the NetSec subreddit that is run by security-oriented people, security-minded. And we had a lot of good feedbacks and people giving ideas and saying, wow, that's a nice project, I really like it, you guys are doing a great job. And we also put it on the PHP subreddit, and people really called us name and were mad at us, like, you're going to break website, you don't know what you're doing, just get better developers, blah, blah, blah. So yeah, just PHP stuff. And if you have questions, we'll be super happy to answer them. And if you'd like to know more, we'll be even more happier to see you in the workshop on Friday morning. Thank you very much for attending the workshop, the talk.